Well, good evening, everybody. Welcome to tonight's talk. I'm Kate Easton from the Lit and Phil, and I'd like to thank you very much indeed for joining us tonight. Very pleased to welcome John Holmes, our speaker tonight. John is Professor of Victorian Literature and Culture at the University of Birmingham, and he is an expert on the connections between literature and science. His books include Darwin's Bards, British and American Poetry in the Age of Evolution, the Pre-Raphaelites and Science, which he actually lectured on in the Lit and Phil a couple of years ago, and Temple of Science, the Pre-Raphaelites and Oxford University Museum of Natural History. Tonight, his topic is quite different, I feel, and really looking forward to it. The Hobbits of Flores. Over to you, John. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Kate, and thank you also to you for turning up, to Elaine, Dion, Myra, and Charlotte, and anybody who may be with you. Okay, so what I want to talk about today is what I think is a really curious phenomenon and development in terms of our understanding of human evolution. So my broader topic, I suppose, is precisely how over the last 20 years, our understanding of human evolution has changed and in relation to different fossil species. But more specifically, I'm very struck, I have been very struck over a few years now, by the extent to which paleoanthropologists, so the scientists who study human fossils, are invoking J.R.R.Tolkein and his world of Middle Earth to understand human evolution and the human past. So this starts with hobbits, which is why I'm wearing my best kind of hobbit outfit. I'm wearing a waistcoat and a red grandad shirt in sort of honor of hobbit fashion. I was hoping to be barefoot, but it's a little bit chilly for that, so I'm not doing that. But I start then with hobbits. In a hole in the ground, there lived a hobbit. The opening line of Tolkien's children's story, The Hobbit. This first hole in the ground is a hobbit hole as it's been reimagined and reconstructed based on Tolkien's stories. But the second hole in the ground is a cave. And this is on the island of Flores in Indonesia. It's called the Liang Bua Cave. I apologize for my pronunciation if that's not correct, but that's how it's written. And it was here in 2003 that a new species of human was discovered. A very short, small human. They're about sort of 3.5 to 4 foot, much the same size as Tolkien imagined his hobbits to be. A very different hole, you'll see, and rather a different hobbit. So on the left, you can see Bilbo Baggins, as imagined in the films, and on the right, you can see Flo. Flo is the hobbit of Flores, known as Flo because of Flores, the island. But these two hobbits have certain things in common, apart from their size. One of the things they have in common is that in both cases, they were visited by a bearded gentleman who came at the lead of an unexpected party of people who come calling for them. Of course, in the case of the Hobbit, that's Gandalf. Again, here from the films, this is Ian McKellen as Gandalf. In the case of Flo, it was Mike Morwood. Mike Morwood was a New Zealand-born paleoanthropologist who worked mainly with Australian colleagues. He died a little while ago, so hence I'm talking about him in the past tense. But it was Morwood who discovered, or who led the team, let's say, of archaeologists that discovered the fossil remains, the skeletal remains of Flo, the Hobbit. And it was also Mike Morwood who came up with this nickname for the skeleton as a hobbit. And that's the kind of start of this process of thinking about human evolution in these terms. So this is a little bit more detail of Morwood's account and why he started to call this specimen the Hobbit. The image, by the way, on the right is probably the most famous pictorial representation of this new species of human, Homo floresiensis, came to be called. Though interestingly, the key specimen is female. This is here represented as male. So I'm going to just read you a little bit about what Morwood says about why he wanted to call the Hobbit, or Homo floresiensis, the Hobbit. The main appeal, this is in a book he writes with Penny van Oosterzee about the discovery of this new species. The main appeal of using it as a species name, however, was the thought of learned types conferences having to seriously discuss the attributes and evolutionary history of Homo hobitus. So he initially suggests that the main appeal was as a joke, basically, and a kind of mockery, a spoof of the learned types who would be having to discuss Homo hobitus. And this kind of element of a joke outraged some of Morwood's colleagues, particularly Peter Brown, who was one of the co-authors, lead co-authors on the main initial papers in Nature about the Hobbits. Peter Brown, in the meantime, had sent me an unequivocal email. As the referees note, this is the referees of the article, the lunatic fringe are going to have a field day with the Flores midget. The last thing I'm willing to do is pour fuel on that particular fire. This is what any reference to hobbits or midgets would do. I can't believe that you could be serious about this. Everyone would think you'd gone nutty. Morwood continues. He warned me that any mention of hobbits in a press conference, even as a nickname, and he would walk out. This was a bit of a shame, really. I'll pick up that quotation where the little ellipsis is in a minute. But Morwood then goes on. It was also not lost on me that the reason that the Australopithecus afarensis skeleton, known as Lucy, had such public recognition and staying power was because of her nickname, which was taken from the Beatles song Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds. As it transpired, the matter was out of Peter's hands. My younger Indonesian colleagues liked the name Hobbit and had begun to use it affectionately for LB1, Liang Hua 1, the fossil from the cave. Hobbit stuck. So this initial kind of account suggests that it's really an exercise partly in fun and partly in publicity. It's partly Morwood is cannily thinking, okay, people will remember this fossil if we refer to it as Hobbit or the Hobbit. And that there's been a lot of toing and froing over Hobbit or the Hobbit because the Hobbit is copyright by Tolkien, and so the Tolkien estate have often tried to stop the word being used in that way, and so hence it's become Hobbit, capitalized in inverted commas. So publicity, a little bit of spoof, bit of affection, I think, here. Certainly a kind of affection that seems to emerge through the team of scientists, including the Indonesian colleagues, liking the name Hobbit. It kind of animates the specimen. So maybe one might think that's all there is to it, just a bit of publicity. But I think it goes rather deeper than this. So this is Morwood's longer description of the why he thought of Hobbit, or rather more a kind of part of the description that was interlaced with the stuff that I showed you already. The name Hobbit was said to mean hole builder or hole dweller, which also seemed appropriate, given that LB1 had been recovered from a very deep hole. It was, I thought, singularly appropriate, a little person who lived in a cozy hole in the ground on an isolated Middle-earth island. Hobbits were also familiar with a type of extinct elephant and were chased by Komodo dragons, the Flores version of the fire-breathing dragon Smaug. So for those of you who know your Tolkien, you'll immediately see that Morwood is referencing the Hobbit and Smaug, so that story. The idea of a Hobbit being somebody who lived in a cozy hole in the ground, well, that's very reminiscent of the beginning of the story The Hobbit, which I quote below there. In a hole in the ground there lived a Hobbit, not a nasty, dirty, wet hole filled with the ends of worms and an oozy smell, nor yet a dry, bare, sandy hole with nothing in it to sit down on or to eat. It was a Hobbit hole, and that means comfort. That word comfort gives you Morwood's idea of coziness, although, frankly, looking at Liang Hua Cave doesn't look all that cozy to me. It looks very airy and probably bat-infested, nevertheless. So then you've got the reference to Smaug, and also the reference to the type of extinct elephant, which I think is a hint at the olifants that Sam particularly is so enchanted by in The Lord of the Rings. So Morwood he may have been claiming on the one hand that it's just an exercise in publicity, but it's also clearly shaping how he's thinking about this person that he's discovered, the remains of this small person. Why does he call it a Middle-earth island? Well, I'll leave that hanging. We'll maybe come back to that. And I'll also come back to that opening about hole builders and hole dwellers a little bit later. But there's something about this response that Morwood has to discovering this fossil that chimes with the response of the wider community of paleoanthropologists to this discovery. So I've called the next few slides "Fiction versus Science?" ? And picking up on that idea of fiction, it's striking how a number of people writing about this discovery feel the need to reach for analogies from fiction. So Tim White, another paleoanthropologist, is quoted as saying, "This is about discovering a lost world instead of creating it from science fiction. It really existed. George Lucas didn't make these creatures up. These are real relatives that nearly lasted to coexist with us." So White is reaching for George Lucas, the Star Wars movies, probably I'm imagining Yoda here as an example, as a kind of analog. This is a real version of that fiction. Also, the phrase "a lost world," well, that invokes Conan Doyle's story, The Lost World, of a group of Edwardian explorers who discover a space where there are still dinosaurs living in South America. Clive Finlayson, too, in one of his books on Neanderthals, says that the discovery seems straight out of a Jules Verne novel. So another sort of science fiction writer, 19th century science fiction writer. So clearly, White, Finlayson, Morwood are all reaching for fiction to express their feelings and thoughts about the discovery of the Flores hobbits. Now, there's a reasonable tradition of there's a tradition of fiction about human evolution and paleoanthropology, and there's also a recurrence within writings by paleoanthropologists of invoking that fiction. So here are a couple of quotations by from recent books on paleoanthropology and human evolution, both of which mention novelists who'd written about it. And they both actually mention The Inheritors by William Golding, which came out in 1955, the same year as the latter volumes of The Lord of the Rings, and The Clan of the Cave Bear. And both of these novels are imagining human Homo sapiens encounters with Neanderthals. So David Reich writes about them. "The encounter of Neanderthals and modern humans has also captured the imagination of novelists. There is hard scientific evidence that modern humans and Neanderthals met. Crucially, the evidence of the fact that we all, or not necessarily all of us, but most of us, particularly those of us who are less recently of African origin, have Neanderthal DNA within us. There must, writes, have been cultural exchange that accompanied the mixture. The novels of William Golding and Jean Auel were right to dramatize these encounters." So The Clan of the Cave Bear, by the way, is from 1980s, I think, a North American novel. Golding's a British writer. And The Clan of the Cave Bear starts a whole series of novels. Rebecca Ragg Sykes, too, in her recent excellent book Kindred on the Neanderthals, writes, "Auel's work is prescient. Her bold speculation about intimate interspecies relations was viewed as somewhat fringe, but 30 years later, genetic science showed she'd been right." There's a pattern to both of these quotations, which is that the novelist is paid tribute to for having imagined something that science then proved to be correct. Science bears out the imaginings of the novelist. So fiction has this sort of speculative role that science then confirms. And as that little extra comment by Rebecca Ragg Sykes points out, also possibly of inspiring people to become paleoanthropologists. And Rebecca Ragg Sykes implies that had a significant effect on her, that the fiction did. But of course, these are stories about human evolution. If you're particularly interested, by the way, there's a whole book on that genre, prehistoric fiction. So it's called The Fire and the Stone. It's by Nicholas Ruddick, prehistoric fiction from Charles Darwin to Jean M. Auel. Ruddick comes up with the idea of a new genre called PF to be in comparison with SF, science fiction. But these stories, Golding's Inheritors, Jean M. Auel's series, are actually about human evolution. They're about human species. What we're looking at here is something rather different, which is invoking a story that isn't about human evolution, that's generally held to be or kind of categorized as fantasy, and using it to think about science. And the same thing goes on with the reference to George Lucas and to Jules Verne. And this raised some suspicions, strikingly, particularly from Henry G. Now, Henry G is an interesting figure because he was the editor of the Nature, well, the editor at Nature who handled the initial papers on Homo floresiensis. And he's written his own book, The Accidental Species, Misunderstandings of Human Evolution, about human evolution. He's also, as he says here, a paid-up Tolkien geek. He's written a book called The Science of Middle-earth. He used to edit, I think, the Tolkien Journal, one of the Tolkien journals. So he's very much somebody who stands on both sides, but he has had serious reservations, which he explains here, mentioning that Richard Dawkins shared them. And he says, if you go look halfway down that quotation, here's my concern. For all the extra publicity, LB1 is now inextricably entwined in the public mind with The Hobbit, and all the immensity of cultural baggage that comes with the name. The problem lies not with now, but the years to come. Will researchers looking at LB1 ever be able to study it without having their thoughts being crowded out by images of Bilbo Baggins? So G's concern is that the fiction might take over from the science, or the fiction might direct the science in certain ways. The science might become overwhelmed by people's prior imaginations shaped by Tolkien's fiction, and the same that word Hobbit. But there's a very interesting article, I think, by somebody called Murray Goulden, which actually points out that this opposition between fiction and science is rather false in this case, because it implies that there's somehow the scientific knowledge, and then if you think about it, the fiction is part of the exercise of communication, like the first things I was saying about Morwood, before I introduced the way in which he talks about there being a genuine appropriateness to the name. Goulden points out that actually the very science itself, those scientific descriptions of the specimen, the way the specimen was imagined, were already a hybrid of science culture and popular culture ideas. So even though Goulden uses this phrase literary technology to mean the particular way in which science papers have to be written, even though science papers and their peer-reviewed work remove any hint of that cultural influence, that wider external non-empirical influence, Goulden points out that actually it's a mistake to then see that as kind of never having played a role. It's to ignore, he says, how the scientists digging at Liangbois cave christened their discovery The Hobbit. It's to ignore the Nature press release announcing the Brown and Morwood papers that references a lost world. So again, that reference to Conan Doyle. And to ignore Henry G's simultaneously published Nature column entitled Flores, God and Cryptozoology. So G himself is writing in Nature, thinking about these issues. So they can't be, Goulden says, and I agree with him, they can't be fully detached. Fiction isn't in opposition to science here. And I think I'll hope to show you more about why that's true as we go on. So, to return back to Morwood for a minute, you'll remember that Morwood says that he discovers, or they discovered this Hobbit in an isolated Middle-earth island. That's the first use I've come across of Middle-earth in the context of paleoanthropology, but it's by no means the last. So, welcome to Middle-earth. Why do we now start to think, why are a number of paleontologists starting to think, paleoanthropologists starting to think about this as a Middle-earth type environment, the environment of human evolution? A little clue comes in this quotation from Clive Finlayson, who I mentioned before. There are also tantalizing glimpses that suggest increasingly that other people may also have been around. As we begin to understand the complex panorama of prehistoric humans in greater detail, we may be surprised to find that the diversity of peoples, from populations to species, was much greater than the simple Homo sapiens Neanderthalensis dichotomy, which we have inherited. The discovery of the hobbits, Homo floresiensis, on Flores is the tip of the iceberg. Finlayson wrote that, published it at least in 2009. The two diagrams that I've put on this slide are both parallel chronological diagrams of the evolution towards the present, so the top is the present, of human beings. The first one's from about 2003, just before the discovery of The Hobbit. The second one is from about 2017. And you can see that there's quite a striking change, because in the first one, the only species that overlaps with Homo sapiens in chronological terms is Homo neanderthalensis, the Neanderthals. That's as recent ago as 2003, so just before the discovery of The Hobbit. That's so let's say 20 years ago. Now, if you look across to the other diagram, you can see that sapiens existed alongside Neanderthals, yes, but also alongside the Denisovans. Current populations include DNA from both of those groups. So modern humans do. Neanderthals, most people outside Africa have, or possibly all people outside Africa have Neanderthal DNA. Denisovan DNA is particularly preserved in Australasians and some other Asian populations, Tibetan populations, and so forth. There's also indication that there seem to be other lost lineages that fed into Homo sapiens. There's Homo floresiensis, the Hobbit. Go back just a little bit and you get Homo naledi, a recent discovery in South Africa. Java man and Peking man are both late survivals of Homo erectus, and some, at least, of the more recent narratives I've read have suggested that Homo erectus definitely survived to close on 100,000 years ago. Here it seems to be about 0.4, but 0.4 million, but 0.1 million is probably more accurate. There's also, since 2017, been another discovery, Homo luzonensis, which is on a Philippine island of Luzon, which is another diminutive human. So it's the idea of a world in which there are lots of different species of human being, which is what we've discovered over, I said what paleoanthropologists have discovered, none of my business, over the last 20 years. But it also has been a discovery that has led them to reach to this analogy with Tolkien. Maybe partly, of course, because Morwood had already seeded that idea with The Hobbit, surely because of that. A key moment comes in 2013. So there's a presentation on the 18th of November at the Royal Society, meeting on ancient DNA. And it's here that David Reich, who we saw before mentioning Golding and Jean Auel, announces some DNA analysis demonstrating the interbreeding of different human groups, particularly Neanderthals and Denisovans, as well as Homo sapiens. So the results of this meeting suggested that interbreeding went on between the members of several ancient human-like groups in Europe and Asia more than 30,000 years ago, including an as yet unknown human ancestor from Asia. Still, I think, as yet unknown. The Denisovans, by the way, may or may not be the same as a group identified, I think, earlier this year, which is called Homo longi, which is also known as the dragon man, based on a Chinese specimen, because we don't have enough fossil evidence of Denisovans or enough DNA evidence from some other fossils to be able to know exactly who they were. Anyway, when this announcement was made, there was a comment that was quoted many, many times by different people, by Mark Thomas, who's an evolutionary geneticist at UCL in London, who said, what it begins to suggest is that we're looking at a Lord of the Rings type world, that there were many hominid populations. So you get this idea then that this is there's a parallel that is beginning to be developed. And it comes through into the literature, at least into the popularizing literature. But again, I want to suggest to you that the popularizing literature actually shows some of the imaginative processes behind the science that maybe the scientific papers, as Murray Goldman points out, seek to sort of suppress. So, for instance, we come back to Finlayson in his next book, The Improbable Primate, How Water Shaped Human Evolution. He writes, by 1.7 million years ago, early hominids, so much earlier than the last 50,000 100,000 years that we've been talking about so far. By 1.7 million years ago, early hominids were widespread across a vast area of northern, eastern, and southern Africa, Central and Southeast Asia, and we presume they also occupied the vast area in between. I have called this the mid-latitude belt, and Dellen and Robrooks call it Savannistan. Here, I will refer to it as Middle Earth, the home of the first humans and their contemporaries. It's a really interesting rhetorical gesture, I think, this, because Finlayson at no point says that he's referencing Tolkien. He just says, I will refer to it as Middle Earth. But he even provides a map. So this is a map of Middle Earth, as imagined by Tolkien, based on maps drawn by Tolkien and then revised by his son Christopher Tolkien under his guidance. And this is Finlayson's map of Middle Earth, the map showing the geographical extent of Middle Earth. N for Northern Middle Earth, S for Southern Middle Earth, which by this point is extended to include Australia and Europe. So why Middle Earth? Why not the Old World, for example, or Afro-Eurasia, or something like that? Well, if we follow it through to a more recent, a yet more recent book, we can see this analogy developing further. So this is from Tom Hyam's excellent book, The World Before Us, published earlier this year, How Science is Revealing a New Story of Our Human Origins. And Hyam tells this story brilliantly, I think, because he very deftly layers on each new discovery of a new species, sometimes in chronological order, but not always in chronological order, in such a way that you just get a sense of more and more different kinds of human being coming into the picture. And again, Hyam reaches for Middle Earth, and he, unlike Finlayson, admits that this is coming directly from Tolkien. So he writes, what we know about the evolution of our genus, Homo, has changed dramatically over the last 2 decades. Research has shown unequivocally that the Earth was a primeval complicated place 50,000 years ago. To borrow from the words of Tolkien, we should think of it as a veritable Middle Earth, in terms of the diversity of forms of the human family that existed at the time. There were 5, 6, or even more different types of human present in various parts of the world. I aim to widen the story of human evolution and explore who these different groups were, as well as asking why it is that we are the last ones left. Later, he references Homo floresiensis and Homo lugenensis specifically as these fabulous discoveries in island Southeast Asia, which have provided further evidence that the Earth was a primevally complicated place, 50 to 100,000 years ago, a Middle Earth in which the human family comprised a multitude of different types and sizes, living in a variety of ecosystems. So again, the question I think that comes up here is partly what I'm going to kind of set out for you in a minute, exactly how far we can push that analogy, how far that analogy is apt and fitting, but also how is Tolkien enabling people to think about the world in which our ancestors, Homo sapiens ancestors, the world they inhabited and the other peoples they may have come into contact with. In other words, not just to communicate this, though I think it does that very well, but actually to think about it. So, a Lord of the Rings type world. Why is it a Lord of the Rings type world? How far does that analogy go? Most obviously, you've got several different types of humanoid within it. The image from a French museum, can't immediately remember which one, on the left-hand side shows you a hobbit, a human, let's say, and a Neanderthal, so Homo floresiensis, Homo sapiens, Homo neanderthalensis. And of course, the DVD cover of The Lord of the Rings, or the poster, shows, well, there you can see a hobbit in the middle, you can see humans, you can see elves, you can just see Gimli the dwarf beneath, as well as the Black Riders and Gandalf. So, to be a bit fanciful about it, how might you think about these multiple humanoid species? How do they pair up? How do they match up with one another? Presumably, Homo sapiens are men, as Tolkien would call them, being of that generation, but for which we can say humans. Homo floresiensis, Mike Morwood has told us, are the hobbits. Does that leave the Neanderthals as the dwarves, perhaps? They're certainly presented as shorter and stockier than ourselves. What about the Denisovans? Are the Denisovans elves, perhaps? I might hint at why that might be a bit later. Or orcs, maybe something rather more alarming. What about Homo erectus? Are they orcs or are they elves? Homo lugennensis would seem to be a tree hobbit, which is a sort of creature that doesn't exist in Tolkien's Middle Earth as we know it, but Gollum behaves rather much like one. And also, as well as there being these multiple species, and obviously I'm being flippant and a bit fanciful by pairing them up like this, and the pairing breaks down because dwarves never interbreed with humans, so far as I know, in Tolkien, but Neanderthals and Homo sapiens certainly interbred. You also have different variations amongst them. So among the Denisovans, for example, are the Denisovans the same as Homo longi, or is that yet another different type? Is Homo erectus the same as Homo ergaster, which is the kind of African equivalent species, or other species names? Similarly, within Tolkien's groups, you have different kinds of hobbits, different kinds of different lineages of human, different lineages of elves. So you've got the multiple humanoid species, and it goes beyond that. We also have in Tolkien hominin speciation, we could say. So the overall kind of framework of Middle Earth is much more creationist. Particularly in the Silmarillion, we're told that elves were created first, humans were created somewhat later, dwarves were created not by the presiding omnipotent deity, the kind of god figure Iluvata, but rather by one of the kind of more angelic rank of people, the Vala. So they're all nominally created, but at the same time we do have speciation, and particularly around the hobbits. It's plain indeed, Tolkien writes in the prologue to The Lord of the Rings, that in spite of later estrangement, hobbits are relatives of ours. What exactly our relationship is can no longer be discovered, yet it is clear that hobbits had in fact lived quietly in Middle-earth for many long years before other folk even became aware of them. That seems to take us back to Morwood's hobbits, to the Homo floresiensis living quietly on their Middle-earth island before other people became aware of them, and yet being relatives of ours, maybe more distant than Tolkien's hobbits are of human beings. By the way, the prop that I was reaching for earlier is this book, which has just come out, The Nature of Middle-earth, which Dion, who was working with me as a PhD student Dion's doing a fantastic project on Tolkien's forests, and Dion is here with us this evening. Dion kindly gave that to me earlier this week, and in this book, Tolkien talks a little bit more about how hobbits might have come into being, a slightly different version of the story. Hobbits seem to, as he was later thinking about it, seem to have possibly been become diminished because of having to escape from the threat of hunting, being actually shot at by full-grown bigger humans. And I suppose if one imagines that in Darwinian terms, it's the hobbits that can hide better, the smaller ones that survive. So you have hominin speciation, you also have hominin interbreeding. Aragorn and Arwen from the film, so this is a human and an elf. Tolkien again, actually, in the same book that I just showed you, Nature of Middle-earth, this is a sort of compendium of weird bits and pieces of writing about the natural history of Middle-earth, really, and species and things. Within that, Tolkien kind of tries to think a little about how it comes to be that humans and elves can interbreed. He thought about it earlier in this letter that I quote here below, but certainly they do, and not often, but on a number of occasions in his stories. The fossil, by the way, on the left there is Denny, or the Denisovan 11, which is the fossil that astonishingly turned out to be the child of a Neanderthal and a Denisovan. It's exactly 50-50 Neanderthal Denisovan DNA. So direct witness to interbreeding, as we see in the Lord of the Rings. It's also striking that Tolkien's Middle-earth was originally conceived as an earlier prehistoric period in our own Earth's history. So he's quite insistent when he writes to W.H. Auden or writes about W.H. Auden's review on The Return of the King. They did correspond quite a lot later, but he writes that Middle-earth is not an imaginary world. The theatre of my tale is this Earth, the one in which we now live, but the historical period is imaginary. He imagines that the ages that are relayed to us in the Silmarillion and the Lord of the Rings. The Lord of the Rings is set famously in the Third Age. It transitions to the Fourth Age with the fall of Sauron. These are earlier ages in human history. And you can see a sense of how that might fit in with the geological record and fossil record. If you look at this little list that Christopher Tolkien, his son, includes in this book, The Lost Road, one of Tolkien, one of the huge series of books called The History of Middle-earth. And The Lost Road was an unfinished novel by Tolkien, a time travel story. And it was going to have these various episodes. It was about somebody, a modern person, who kind of got access to these earlier past stages. And they're listed here. There's going to be possibly a Lombard story. Then you get a Norse story, an English story, a Tuatha De Danann story, or Tirnannog, so a kind of Irish story. And then it goes back to painted caves, and then to the Ice Age, great figures in ice, and then before the Ice Age. I think the painted caves are something like the Lascaux caves in France, so the Ice Age art. So you get these kind of, clearly Tolkien is imagining at this stage in the composition that the things that happen in Middle-earth happen before the Ice Age. Post-Beleriand and the Elendil and Gil-galad story of the assault on Thu. Well, Thu is Sauron. So that is the battle at which the ring is cut off Sauron's finger, if you go back to what then happens in The Lord of the Rings, although that's a later development of the story in Tolkien's imagination. So that's the end of the Second Age. Numenor is set in the Second Age. So and then the First Age is back to the Silmarillion. So Tolkien is actually writing about prehistory. It's an imagined prehistory, but it's an imagined prehistory that slots into that moment before what he thinks of as the Ice Age, though of course there were successive Ice Ages, rather the same moment that Finlayson and Tom Higham are writing about as Middle-earth. So how does any of this fit with Tolkien's own thinking on human evolution? This is from Tolkien's poem Mythopoeia, which he wrote in about the 1930s. And this, he says, blessed are the legend makers with their rhyme of things not found within recorded time. So legends cut against recorded time, but recorded, of course, is only the historical record. It's not everything that happened. So legend creates for Tolkien a space in which you can imagine what might have happened, as well as things that didn't happen. He then imagines himself being among the minstrels. And then he says, I will not walk with your progressive apes, erect and sapient. Before them gapes the dark abyss to which their progress tends, if by God's mercy progress ever ends and does not ceaselessly revolve the same unfruitful course with changing of a name. I've sometimes taken this to mean that Tolkien is kind of saying, okay, I'm not going to accept evolution. I'm not going to accept a movement from Homo erectus to Homo sapiens. But I think he's actually saying, I'm not going to accept a presumption of progress. I'm not going to accept a reading of evolution that is necessarily progressive. Because I think Tolkien does think about human evolution and some of the things he's doing. This takes us back to Morwood and his Hobbit. You remember I said I was going to return to this question. The name Hobbit was said to mean hole builder or hole dweller, which also seemed appropriate. Now, what that shows is that Morwood is not just a reader of Tolkien. He's the kind of reader of Tolkien who reads the appendices to The Lord of the Rings. He doesn't, and remembers them. He doesn't just read The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, because these are from two parallel appendices, Tolkien's accounts of the origins of the word Hobbit. And you can see that Tolkien was fascinated by languages and the history of languages and etymologies and inventing languages and thinking through the logic of an invented language. And he also kind of presented himself as the translator of the material in The Lord of the Rings, originally written by principally Bilbo and Frodo, and other material by Merry and Sam and so forth. So I'm not going to read these details, except that you can see you've got hole builder, you've got hole dweller. They're actually alternative meanings. And I think Tolkien says that they're translated from Holbitla itself being a version of the word kudukan, this sort of imagined set of translations. I think it's actually a rather different etymology coming in here, or at least as well. And that is from this source here. This is Carolus Linnaeus. So Linnaeus is the great systematist of nature. He's the one who gave us the binomial system, Homo sapiens, genus, species. He is a Swedish naturalist of the mid-18th century, and he published multiple editions of this book called Systema Naturae. And the 10th was the first really big one where he went into detail about each species. It's also the only one in which he says that there are 2 species of Homo. There's not only Homo sapiens, us, also known as Homo diurnis, the daylight person. There's also Homo troglodytes, also known as Homo nocturnis, the nighttime person, or Homo sylvestris, the man of the woods, the wild man of the woods. Possibly the orangutan is one example of this creature, but troglodytes also becomes the species name later for chimpanzees, and it comes from the Roman scholar Pliny and a supposed group of people living in Africa, in Ethiopia, in the ancient world, who lived in caves, who retired into caves, who literally crept into holes, dwelt in holes, hole dwellers, in fact, one would say. And I think Tolkien is well aware that in imagining Hobbit as hole dweller, he's recreating this forgotten type of human that stands on the borders in Linnaeus between being a human or an ape. Is it another species? It is at this point. It maybe then becomes altogether another genus. And what was Pliny talking about? Were those people? Were they chimpanzees? Were they another imagined lost species of human beings? So I think Tolkien is aware of how his own work fits into some of these thinking about human evolution. Okay, then I want to close just with a couple of kind of thoughts on not only why there's a sort of appropriateness to reaching for Middle Earth, but what reaching for Middle Earth might do for us in terms of thinking about the world where our ancestors evolved. There's something that Tolkien says in a letter to a publisher, Milton Waldman, in around 1951, about his legends, and he's talking particularly about the Silmarillion here. He's thinking about publishing it. He says that it differs from all similar things, all similar legendary things, in not being anthropocentric. Its center of view and interest is not men, but elves. Men came in, inevitably. After all, the author is a man, and if he has an audience, they will be men, but they remain peripheral, latecomers, and however growingly important, not principals. Now, it's a bit... it's easy to see this in the Silmarillion, if you know that book. It's maybe a little harder to see it in The Lord of the Rings with the figure of Aragorn and the Return of the King, but think about how much of the activity of that book centers on hobbits, who are not men, strictly speaking, although they seem to have evolved from men. So what Tolkien gives us is the opportunity for a change of vantage, where we aren't assuming that we are always the center of the story, that Homo sapiens is the destined one, the significant one, the most accomplished one, the one that was always going to survive, the one whose perspectives we have to take. This chimes with some of the things that recent paleontologists have been saying. So Chris Stringer, in The Origin of Our Species, Chris Stringer, very famous and influential paleoanthropologist at the Natural History Museum, always comes out, kind of the first person that the press always goes to for a comment on any new discovery in human evolution. Says that we can only inhabit one version of being human, the only version that survives today. What is fascinating is that paleoanthropology shows us those other paths to becoming human, their successes and their eventual demise, whether through failure or just sheer bad luck. So what Tolkien allows us to start to think about is what it might be like to be a different kind of human with different attributes. Tom Hyam, in another of his references to Middle-earth in his book, writes that sediment DNA has the potential to unlock so much about our past and more of the truth about what happened in the Middle and Upper Paleolithic when modern humans met Denisovans and all of the other characters in the prehistoric Earth. The reason I want prehistoric Middle Earth, the reason I give you that quotation is that it starts with sediment DNA and it ends with Middle Earth. And I want to suggest to you that actually Tolkien, thinking through some of the things implicit in Tolkien, might also have the potential to unlock so much about our past and the moments when modern humans met Denisovans. So, for example, one might want to think about what these different kinds of humans thought of one another. What sort of responses might they have had to one another? And Tolkien's books give us a huge panoply of different ranges of possible responses, from admiration and love, suspicion, the kind of prejudice that the elves and the dwarves have against one another, even though they both seem to be largely kind of well-intentioned beings, and that Gimli and Legolas have difficulty getting over, but do get over very profoundly. A sense of a kind of common humanity, the way that the humans and the elves and the dwarves and the hobbits and indeed even the ents all kind of end up principally but not exclusively on the same side. That idea also of a common humanity is crucial when there's a moment in The Lord of the Rings where Samwise Gamgee, one of the hobbits, first witnesses a battle between humans when he sees the people in Ithilien, the people of Gondor and Ithilien, Faramir's party, if you like, fighting against Haradrim, who come from the south. And initially that seems to be a potential othering of the Haradrim as kind of oriental and enemy, and possibly even kind of with racist hints, but that's immediately undercut by Sam, who sees this as the battle of human against human and dislikes it. It doesn't like seeing that, doesn't like the spectacle. Then you might think about the different priorities, the different ways of life that different populations have in The Lord of the Rings. The Rohirrim and the Woses, the wild men of the woods, living near one another, but living very different existences, existences that come into conflict, again, not because of ill will, but because of the differences of culture and expectation. And of course, there's also the orcs. There's also that possibility that maybe people saw other kinds of people as not like themselves at all, as other, as evil or vicious or threatening or hateful. So I think Tolkien gives us multiple ways of thinking about that perspective. And I'm just going to give you one final little thought, riffing on Clive Finlayson's question: how did humans get to occupy Middle-earth and where did they come from? Well, obviously, Tolkien gives a full answer to that question in terms of his Middle-earth, but how might Tolkien help us to think about that question in terms of Finlayson's Middle-earth? I think it has a lot to do with thinking about where Middle-earth is, where the humans get to. And one of the things that I find most extraordinarily striking about the discoveries in Flores and Homo lugionensis is that these very small new species of human, very old, it would seem, from their connections to other species, possibly diminished versions of Homo erectus, possibly even some of the anatomical links suggest they might even be closer related to Homo habilis, which is a very ancient hominid in Africa, which had not previously been deemed or thought to have left Africa at all. Anyway, these very ancient humans are living on islands on the far side of the Wallace Line. The Wallace Line is the line of deep sea that cuts through the Indonesian archipelago, and that can only be crossed by boat of some kind or another. So the ancestors of these animals, these people, not animals, the ancestors of these people, who are of course animals, as we all are, got to these islands by some form of craft, some form of boat, some form of travel. At least we have no reason to doubt that is the case. It seems more likely that than that they sort of inadvertently ended up there, although they may have done. But the odds seem to me to be that they got there by boat. So if they got there by boat, that suggests that human beings, long before Homo sapiens, have been building boats of some kind or another, or are some way of getting across the sea. There's the substantial Denisovan DNA in the people of Papua New Guinea and Australia also suggests the Denisovans made it across. Which is why I was wondering whether the Denisovans might be the elves, because Tolkien, it's the elves that teach humans, how to sail. So what I want to suggest to you is that Tolkien might also give us a way of thinking about ourselves as not the center of the story, and not necessarily even the most gifted of these hominids. We may have learnt things from the others. The story is often that we developed culture and things, and maybe disseminated it to the Neanderthals and so forth. But maybe we should reverse that. Maybe we should take ourselves off our pedestal and think, perhaps through thinking with Tolkien about the way in which we may be the beneficiaries of the brilliance of some of these other species, gifts they had that perhaps we didn't. And the fact that we didn't know about them for such a long time is in a way, it's a wonder of science that we've rediscovered them, but it's also a sort of fading from the memory, fading into legend, as happens to so many different humans within Tolkien. The hobbits to the Rohirrim are a legend. The Ents to the hobbits are a myth, a fiction. Often there is this kind of sense that the peoples beyond are a fantasy, and yet we found them. Not only have we found them, but by thinking through Tolkien, we can perhaps think more about what that relationship in Middle Earth, as it now seems to be called, was like. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much indeed, John. Has anybody got any questions or comments about the talk? Are you intending, John, to write this up as a paper for publication?
I'd like to. I mean, I'm actually thinking of it more as something that might. I've been working for a long time on a possible book on the role of mythology in thinking about human evolution. And at the moment, I envisage this as a chapter in that book. But whether that's where it will end up, I'm not sure. Maybe it will be it'll be a paper, or maybe not. I don't think I'm going to have time to write the book for several years, so it can mulch during that time. Myra, have you unmuted?
I was just going to say thank you very much. It certainly was very interesting, and takes one. If this is all new to you, it's certainly opening the mind. We've got lots of references to follow up, and yes, thank you very much.
Good. I'm glad you enjoyed it.
Very enjoyable.
If anybody wants to put anything in the chat, by the way, in a way of questions, if you find that if that's an easier way of doing things, you could do. But also, please feel free just to I mean, I've spoken to you for nearly an hour. Feel free to go and pour yourselves a drink or a cup of tea or something instead.
Do you actually enjoy Tolkien's work as stories in themselves?
Yeah, I do very much. I mean, it's been interesting coming back to Tolkien because I read him a lot as a child or as a teenager, and then I kind of stopped, and for a long time Tolkien wasn't really taken very seriously as a writer, and was I think very much unfairly perceived to be childish or escapist. And I don't think he's any of those things, but I spent a lot of time doing other things, and then I sort of thought, well, actually, Tolkien is really productive for thinking about a lot of things. And also, it is true that I have been reading him to my children, and during lockdown, I read The Lord of the Rings aloud to my younger daughter, who was 11 at the time, and that reading him aloud really gave me a sense of his verbal artistry. And range as a writer, extraordinary range. So yes, I do like him very much. Probably.
It's amusing to think that we might be evolving more like we'd like to think of ourselves perhaps more like the elves, but we're probably more like the orcs, I think.
yeah, indeed, yes. And I think Tolkien probably thought of some of these different kinds as being sort of facets of ourselves.
Yeah.
Tendencies that we might go in. I always think that his orcs dialogue sounds to me as though it's based on conversations he heard in the trenches, I think, between particularly some of the soldiers, the kind of reaching for violent, aggressive language. I think that's probably what shaped that.
Well, John, I shall bring the evening to a conclusion. I'd like to thank you on behalf of the Little Phil and on behalf of everyone here tonight. And
My pleasure. Thank you for inviting me
it's
again.
great, very grateful that you've given up your time to talk to us. And you have an open invitation to come up to Little Phil in person whenever you may choose to do so. And we look forward to seeing you again in the flesh at some point.
Yes, thank you very much. And if I'm in Newcastle, I will definitely look you up.
Please do. Righto. Well, good night, everybody, and thank you again, John.
Thanks very much indeed, Kay.
Good night.
Thanks everyone for coming.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.